You're watching the David Lovins channel on YouTube. Here's actually my vehicle. Hi, and welcome to the Hyborean Age, part 12. We got my coffee, I got my smoke, I got my book. Oh yeah, I wanted to show you. This is the mini Necromonicon that my bartender friend gave me, based on the work of H.P. Lovecraft, who was a pen pal with Robert E. Howard. They never met in real life, but they had quite a correspondence. I'd kill to read those letters. So, part 12. I'm on page 27 of the Hyborean Age. And looks like I have 5 pages. Maybe I can do it all in one sitting. We'll see. The world at that time presents some such picture. A vast Pictish empire, wild, rude, and barbaric, stretches from the coasts of Vanaheim in the north to the southernmost shores of Zingara. It stretches east to include all Aquilonia except Gunderland, the northernmost province, which, as a separate kingdom in the hills, survived the fall of the empire and still maintains its independence. The Pictish Empire also includes Argos, Ophir, the western part of Koth, and the westernmost lands of Shem. Opposed to this barbaric empire is the empire of the Hyrcanians, of which the northern boundaries are the ravaged lines of Hyperborea, and the southern, the deserts south of the lands of Shem, Zamora, Berthunia, the border kingdom, Corinthia, most of Koth, and all the eastern lands of Shem are included in this empire. The borders of Samaria are intact. Neither Pict nor Hyrcanian has been able to subdue these warlike barbarians. Nemedia, dominated by the Aesir mercenaries, resists all invasions. In the north, Nordheim, Samaria, and Nemedia separate the conquering races, but in the south, Koth has become a battleground where Picts and Hyrcanians war incessantly. Sometimes the eastern warriors expel the barbarians from the kingdom entirely. Again, the plains and cities are in the hands of the western invaders. In the far south, Stygia, shaken by the Hyrcanian invasion, is being encroached upon by the great black kingdoms. And in the far north, the Nordic tribes are restless, warring continually with the Sumerians and sweeping the Hyperborean frontiers. Gorm was slain by Heilmar, a chief of the Nemedian Aesir. He was a very old man, nearly 100 years old. In the 75 years which had elapsed since he first heard the tale of empires from the lips of Eris, a long time in the life of a man, but a brief space in the tale of nations, he had welded an empire from straying savage clans. He had overthrown a civilization. He who had been born in a mud-walled, wattle-roofed hut in his old age sat on golden thrones and gnawed joints of beef presented to him on golden dishes by naked slave girls who were the daughters of kings. Conquest and the acquiring of wealth altered not the Pict. Out of the ruins of the crushed civilization, no new culture arose phoenix-like. The dark hands which shattered the artistic glories of the conquered never tried to copy them. Though he sat among the glittering ruins of shattered palaces and clad his hard body in the silks of vanquished kings, the Pict remained the eternal barbarian, ferocious elemental, interested only in the naked primal principles of life, unchanging, unerring in his instincts, which were all for war and plunder, and in which arts and the cultured progress of humanity had no place. Not so with the Aesir, who settled in Nemedia. These soon adopted many of the ways of their civilized allies, modified powerfully, however, by their own intensely virile and alien culture. Sorry, I needed to take a killing break. I have bloodlust, you know. Ah, crap, what the hell is this? I don't want that. Some update on my storage device. Kill, kill, kill. That's why I'm a good reader of Robert E. Howard's work. I'm a savage. Not very noble. That's right. I'm a very coarse person. Alright, that was some good killing. I think all wars should be settled in video games, and no one in real life would have to die. For a short age, Pict and Hyrcanian snarled at each other over the ruins of the world they had conquered. Then began the Glacier Ages and the Great Nordic Drift. Before the southward moving ice fields, the northern tribes drifted, driving kindred clans before them. The Aesir blotted out the ancient kingdoms of Hyperborea, and across its ruins came to grips with the Hyrcanians. Nemedia had already become a Nordic kingdom, ruled by the descendants of the Aesir mercenaries. Driven before the onrushing tides of Nordic invasion, the Cimmerians were on the march, and neither army nor city stood before them. They surged across and completely destroyed the kingdom of Gunderland, and marched across ancient Aquilonia, hewing their irresistible way through the Pictish hosts. They defeated the Nordic Nemedians and sacked some of their cities, but did not halt. They continued eastward, overthrowing a Hyrcanian army on the borders of Brithunia. Behind them, hordes of Aesir and Vanir swarmed into the lands, and the Pictish Empire reeled beneath their strokes. Nemedia was overthrown, and the half-civilized Nordics fled before their wilder kinsmen, leaving the cities of Nemedia ruined and deserted. These fleeing Nordics, who had adopted the name of the older kingdom, and to whom the term Nemedian henceforth refers, came into the ancient land of Koth, expelled both Picts and Hyrcanians, and aided the people of Shem to throw off the Hyrcanian yoke. All over the Western world, the Picts and Hyrcanians were staggering before this younger, fiercer people. A band of Aesir drove the eastern riders from Brithunia and settled there themselves, adopting the name for themselves. The Nordics, who had conquered Hyperborea, assailed their eastern enemies so savagely that the dark-skinned descendants of the Lemurians retreated into the steppes, pushed irresistibly back toward Villaye. Alright, I need some more killing. I like the blonde. She reminds me of a girl from Sweden. Nice bangs on her. As you can see, she's wearing no underwear. This guy has bangs too. He's like He-Man. This guy's a field medic. Oh, he's dead now. Then I jump into the lake so I can be safe. Meanwhile, the Cimmerians, wandering southeastward, destroyed the ancient Hyrcanian kingdom of Turan and settled on the southwestern shores of the inland sea. The power of the eastern conquerors was broken. Before the attacks of the Nordheimer and the Cimmerians, they destroyed all their cities, butchered such captives as were not fit to make the long march, and then, herding thousands of slaves before them, rode back into the mysterious east, skirting the northern edge of the sea and vanishing from Western history until they rode out of the east again, thousands of years later, as Huns, Mongols, Tatars, and Turks. With them in their retreat went thousands of Zamorians and Zingarans, who were settled together far to the east, formed a mixed race, and emerged ages afterward as gypsies. Meanwhile, also, a tribe of Vanir adventurers had passed along the Pictish coast southward, ravaged ancient Zingara, and came into Stygia, which, oppressed by a cruel aristocratic ruling class, was staggering under the thrust of the Black Kingdoms to the south. The red-haired Vanir led the slaves in a general revolt, overthrew the reigning class, and set themselves up as a caste of conquerors. They subjugated the northernmost Black Kingdoms and built a vast southern empire, which they called Egypt. From these red-haired conquerors, the earlier pharaohs boasted descent. The Western world was now dominated by Nordic barbarians. The Picts still held Aquilonia and part of Zingara and the western coast of the continent, but east to Villaye and from the Arctic Circle to the lands of Shem, the only inhabitants were roving tribes of Nordheimer, excepting the Cimmerians, settled in the old Turanian kingdom. There were no cities anywhere, except in Stygia and the lands of Shem. The invading tides of Picts, Hyrcanians, Cimmerians, and Nordics had leveled them in ruins, and the once dominant Hyboreans had vanished from the earth, leaving scarcely a trace of their blood in the veins of their conquerors. Only a few names of lands, tribes, and cities remained in the languages of the barbarians, to come down through the centuries connected with distorted legend and fable, until the whole history of the Hyborean Age was lost sight of in a cloud of myths and fantasies. Thus, in the speech of the gypsies lingered the terms Zingara and Zamora. The Aesir, who dominated Nemedia, were called Nemedians, and later figured in Irish history, and the Nordics who settled in Brithunia were known as Brythunians, Brythons, or Britons. There was no such thing at that time as a consolidated Nordic empire. As always, the tribes had each its own chief or king, and they fought savagely among themselves. What their destiny might have been will not be known, because another terrific convulsion of the earth, carving out the lands as they are known to moderns, hurled all into chaos again. Great strips of the western coast sank. Vanaheim and western Asgard, uninhabited and glacier-haunted wastes for 100 years, vanished beneath the waves. The ocean flowed around the mountains of western Cimmeria to form the North Sea. These mountains became the islands later known as England, Scotland, and Ireland, and the waves rolled over what had been the Pictish wilderness and the Bossonian marches. In the north, the Baltic Sea was formed, cutting Asgard into the peninsulas later known as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And far to the south, the Stygian continent was broken away from the rest of the world on the line of cleavage formed by the river Nilus in its westward trend. Over Argos, western Koth, and the western lands of Shem washed the blue ocean men later called the Mediterranean, but where land sank elsewhere, a vast expanse west of Stygia rose out of the waves, forming the whole western half of the continent of Africa. The buckling of the land thrust up great mountain ranges in the central part of the northern continent. Whole Nordic tribes were blotted out, and the rest retreated eastward. The territory about the slowly drying inland sea was not affected, and there, on the western shores, the Nordic tribes began a pastoral existence, living in more or less peace with the Cimmerians and gradually mixing with them. In the west, the remnants of the Picts, reduced by the cataclysm once more to the status of Stone Age savages, began, with the incredible virility of their race, once more to possess the land until, at a later age, they were overthrown by the westward drift of the Cimmerians and Nordics. This was so long after the breaking up of the continent that only meaningless legends told of former empires. There's a nicer view to look at. I only have one page left. This drift comes within the reach of modern history and need not be repeated. It resulted from a growing population which thronged the steppes west of the inland sea, which still later, much reduced in size, was known as the Caspian, to such an extent that migration became an economic necessity. The tribes moved southward, northward, and westward into those lands now known as India, Asia Minor, and Central and Western Europe. They came into these countries as Aryans, but there were variations among these primitive Aryans, some of which are still recognized today, others which have long been forgotten. The blonde Achaeans, Gauls, and Britons, for instance, were descendants of pure-blooded Aesir. The Nemedians of Irish legendary were the Nemedian Aesir. The Danes were descendants of pure-blooded Vanir. The Goths, ancestors of the other Scandinavian and Germanic tribes, including the Anglo-Saxons, were descendants of a mixed race whose elements contained Vanir, Aesir, and Cimmerian strains. The Gaels, ancestors of the Irish, and Highland Scotch, descended from pure-blooded Cimmerian clans. The Cymric tribes of Britain were a mixed Nordic Cimmerian race which preceded the purely Nordic Britons into the Isles, and thus gave rise to a legend of Gaelic priority. The Cimbri who fought Rome were of the same blood, as well as the Gimere of the Assyrians and Grecians, and Gomer of the Hebrews. Other clans of the Cimmerians adventured east of the drying inland sea, and a few centuries later, mixed with Hyrcanian blood, returned westward as Scythians. The original ancestors of the Gaels gave their name to modern Crimea. The ancient Sumerians had no connection with the Western race. They were a mixed people of Hyrcanian and Shemitish bloods who were not taken with the conquerors in their retreat. Many tribes of Shem escaped that captivity, and from pure-blooded Shemites, or Shemites mixed with Hyborean or Nordic blood, were descended the Arabs, Israelites, and other straighter-featured Semites. The Canaanites, or Alpine Semites, traced their descent from Shemitish ancestors, mixed with the Cushites, settled among them by their Hyrcanian masters. The Elamites were a typical race of this type. The short, thick-limbed Etruscans, base of the Roman race, were descendants of a people of mixed Stygian, Hyrcanian, and Pictish strains, and originally lived in the ancient kingdom of Koth. The Hyrcanians, retreating to the eastern shores of the continent, evolved into the tribes later known as Tatars, Huns, Mongols, and Turks. The origins of other races of the modern world may be similarly traced. In almost every case, older far than they realize, their history stretches back into the mists of the forgotten Hyborean Age. Okay, finally finished. That took a long time. Often I felt like I was reading the same material over and over again. It's a fictional essay to set up his Hyborean world for both King Cole and Conan. So, thanks for listening. I'm glad I finally read the thing. Bye.